Awesome. Cool. Alrighty. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the MSA SPS, or the Mycological Society of America Student and Postdoc Section Students Mycological Symposium. It's a mouthful there. Today, this event is co-hosted by the International Congress of Armenian Mycologists. We'll be starting on the dot to give our main speaker enough time to explain her work and for questions later on. We're so excited to have you here for our fourth meeting on the day of the Armenian Genocide Memorial Day. We wanted to bring awareness of what this month means to Armenians worldwide, as this year is the 106th anniversary of the genocide, a word finally used and recognized by President Joe Biden today, and thus the United States. Pasted below is his statement, if you'd like to spend the time and read it. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that there. Okay. So my name is Tanya Kirbisoyan. I am a fourth-year microbiology graduate student in Dr. Jason Steich's lab, and I am the vice chair of the MSA SPS. I have other members of the board joining us today too. We have Jillian, we have Casey, we have Rob Powers, we have hopefully others joining us soon. And so here is our website, the student section website for you to peruse and maybe even join the MSA organization as well. Anyways, welcome. Firstly, I would like to say, if you have any questions during the presentation, please write them down in the chat and we can address it later on. Either I can read it to the speaker, or when I call upon you, you can ask the question yourself. This meeting, again, will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube. And then we'll be sharing this link through our Facebook and Twitter as well. And so our speaker's talk will be about hopefully 50 minutes to 55 minutes, and they'll give us maybe 5 minutes at the end for questions, okay? So our speaker today is Miss Patricia Kaishian. She received her BA in biology with a concentration in environmental studies in 2013 from Wheaton College, Massachusetts. In August 2020, she defended her PhD in forest pathology and mycology from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Her doctoral work was focused on the taxonomy, biodiversity, and ecology of this is a difficult word.
Thank
you. Anascomycotin fungi. And she is broadly trained in the taxonomy of macro and microfungi with considerable field experience in the neotropics. Currently, she's working as a postdoc researcher in the Amy Lab at Purdue University, where she's serving as curator of fungi at the Arthur Fungarium and Crable Herbarium. There, she's working on taxonomy and barcoding of rust fungi, a group of plant pathogens. Beyond more of the traditional scientific work, she's also working in the realms of philosophy of science, feminist bioscience, ecofeminism, and queer theory, exploring how mycology and other scientific disciplines are situated in and informed by our sociopolitical landscape. You could read more in her publication, The Science Underground, Mycology as a Queer Discipline, which appears in the journal Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, and Technoscience. And so I'll paste that link as well, so you can read that later on. And so finally, she is a founding member of the International Congress of Armenian Mycologists, a research organization comprised of ethnically Armenian mycologists who seek to simultaneously advance mycological science and Armenian sovereignty and liberation. Without further ado, Patty, go ahead and begin with your presentation.
Thanks, Tanya. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm really happy to be here with you. And as Tanya said, as this is the Day of Remembrance for the Armenian Genocide, so we thought it would be appropriate to share a piece, to share this work because while it is rooted in science and mycology, it is philosophical in nature. So I'm sort of exploring the ways in which human society and culture have entered into scientific frameworks and how systems of power in society have impacted our pursuit of knowledge. So yeah, that it seems at first maybe like it might not be connected, but I'm going to explore all the ways in which these things in fact are very much connected. So thank you for being with me today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And does that looks good? Is that okay? So as Tanya mentioned, this work is based, this presentation is based on a paper that is published in a peer-reviewed journal, which is based on feminism and technoscience. And I co-authored this with my dear friend Hazmik Jalakian, who is also a fellow Armenian. So this is a project, this is a version of the presentation of the work that we published together. So the motivation for this work was to conduct better and more ethical science and sort of explore how these different forces in human society can interact with science. So this work is oriented towards both scientists, academics from the humanities, and anyone really who's seeking to engage critically with science and who's interested in how discourse ripples across various disciplines and areas of life. So in general, this was motivated by the strong belief that scientists are intellectually and morally obligated to understand the positioning of their field and research in the greater landscape of human society. And that's regardless of how small or narrow the subject matter may feel and how removed from daily life it may appear. So we believe that it's important that scientists are familiar with the nature of unconscious bias and how it informs not only our interactions with students and colleagues, but also how it shapes the very questions we choose to ask, the ways in which we design our studies, how we choose to relay our findings and interpret our findings. So we also believe it's important that scientists are able to engage with topics in philosophy of science so that we can really reckon with like the limitations and faults in our pursuit of knowledge, but also at the same time meaningfully defend ourselves against anti-science, sort of anti-intellectualism, which is unfortunately also very common today. So it's these trying to hold those things in this at once, right? We want to be science positive and you know, be proud of the work that science is capable of, but also reflect on its potential limitations and the historical misuse of science. So I give this talk to a variety of, I've given this talk a few times to different audiences. So as mycologists here in the Mycological Society, you know, there's a scientific element that you're familiar with. So this talk does have a mix of different slides where I'm sort of catering to one group or another. So there's some slides that are more theory heavy and then some that are really technical, but I'm going to try to sort of gloss over all of the things and make sure we have a well-rounded understanding of what I'm trying to communicate. So these are the technical features of fungi that collectively distinguish them from other groups of organisms. And as you probably know, this is a fairly recent tree of life, I think from 2016 or 17. And down in the bottom right corner is the eukaryotes, and we are in the group Opisthecanta, which is the supergroup that contains fungi and animals and amoebae. And as you probably know, fungi share a more recent common ancestor with animals and amoebae than they do plants, which is surprising to a lot of people who are not familiar with fungi. But there's also other ways to think about fungi. There are the definitions that are scientifically informed, and then there are social definitions, and then there's sort of a realm of kind of multidisciplinary ways of understanding fungi. So we have these clinical, more like specific definitions based in science, like eukaryotic, heterotrophic, chitin, etc. But then we have the ways in which society has also seen or categorized fungi, particularly looking at it from Western Europe and the United States. So those are traits such as poisonous, diseased, degenerate, deadly, gross, and weird. And but also when you think about the vegetated environment that enabled the transition of animals to land and the evolution of amphibians and then reptiles, birds, and mammals, all of this was bound to symbiotic fungi, known as we know are mycorrhizae. And over 90% of plants form these associations that we know of, and the myceliated landscape sustains these cascades of life, which are sort of these full of these nested biological systems through which all of the evolutionary layers, certainly of human biology, but many other organisms' biology, are really indistinguishable. So fungi are these terraforming bodies. They're trans-individual in that they create these collective ecological histories. And they are constantly engaged in this continual process of decomposition, nutrient reallocation, and the spectrum of symbiosis. We know that fungi can be remediators by digesting fossil fuels and converting them into fungal sugars. We know of this one instance that does require more research, I think, but of a fungus found in the reactors of Chernobyl that can metabolize cesium-137. And really, there are, single cellular forms of filamentous hyphal networks of fungi that can be like the largest living thing on the planet. And really, fungi are in every conceivable niche. They're of, on, and within human and non-human bodies. So fungi are all of these things. But to understand sort of, despite that, everything I just said, there are complex social histories that have influenced the outcomes and trajectories of mycology and have rendered it sort of this marginalized science. This kingdom has been really persistently maligned, feared, and misunderstood. And those cultural forces have a material, abstract, not just hypothetical, but a material influence on our scientific knowledge and understanding of this group. So in Western Europe and the US particularly, children are raised to fear mushrooms, which are unilaterally viewed as, again, poisonous, deadly disease, degenerate, etc. And that although science, in its ideal form, should be this equal opportunity, like investigative methodological tool, we know that the history of modern science has been disproportionately shaped by a certain subset of people, particularly, men from Western Europe, and that has come at the exclusion of many other voices. And consequently, there are these dominant cultural lenses that pervade science. So, namely, heteronormativity, racism, sexism, ableism, and the binaries inherent to those structures. So, all of these have materially influenced scientific understanding. And I'm sort of using mycology as a case study to explore the ways in which that has happened, and fungal biology specifically. But truly, I think throughout all of the sciences, it's important to reflect on the ways in which it's actually quite surprising to the granular level at which this will reveal itself. So they're not just these broad strokes ideas, but it surfaces in even smaller amounts of smaller collections of data and concepts. So this is an excerpt from a poem by Emily Dickinson. There's just all of this really strong mycophobic rhetoric that pervades a lot of culture and a lot of, I guess, elements of Western European culture and American culture. So in this poem, Dickinson is comparing mushrooms to Judas, the disciple who betrayed Jesus, to the chief priests, which then led to his crucifixion. And so she's suggesting here that there is this sanctity to nature that is defiled by the mushroom, as if they're not only this like aberration of nature, but also this like active and sort of malicious threat to a holy place, which is very loaded. And then later in the poem, she refers to mushrooms as the quote, elf of plants, which echoes this Linnaean concept of fungi being lower plants, which I'll talk even more about later. And this is another example from Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes. And I bolded the sort of the words of interest here, like sickly, festered, monstrous, foul pustules, all of this regarding mushrooms. So he's intentionally using this language that's really kind of grounded in this like kind of anger and disgust. And it's, he's trying to use that to create this picture of fungi. And instead of recognizing them as being very integral to forest health, they're seen as like foreign and frightening and death. And you can see that this is like obviously born out of a lack of understanding for fungi, which is like, you can't expect everyone to just know about their biology, but it's interesting to see how that transfers like the lack of knowledge pretty directly results in fear and disgust. So that's common throughout for people, like if we kind of become reviled by the things that seem different to us. So to sort of understand how this happened, I'm going to take a step back and ask a very broad question, like what is science? And I did mention this is my like definition of science. It's an equal opportunity investigative methodological tool, ideally. Science, as scientists, we use tools and methods to access knowledge, and we standardize our work to create a common language. And this is really valuable. It's tremendously powerful because it allows for this participation in like a globalized pursuit of discovery. And I think there's some really, one of the things I like about science is that it ideally is something that literally anyone can participate in. And if you're willing to use the methods, and we kind of all, like all humans who decide to participate in science are, kind of participating in this collective incrementalism to understand the universe. And I like that a lot about science. So every discovery, no matter how small, is sort of infinity minus one, right? With the universe being infinitely complex. So and I like that no one person, carries science on their shoulders. It's truly about many scientists working towards this pursuit of curiosity. And replication and standardization are the hallmarks of science for good reason. In order for these ideas and for the data that we accumulate to be recognized as valid, they need to be able to be replicated, and and in order to replicate, we need to have, try to have common language around how we're describing our work. And I think that this is a good place to sort of differentiate between pseudoscience and alternative ways of knowing, because science is a way of knowing, and it is a way of knowing out of many. Pseudoscience is when you sort of purport to be using the scientific method but fail to actually abide by it, and you're you're pretty intentionally either manipulating data outright or trying to give the impression or the illusion of something more standardized or more rigorous than you're actually presenting. And that, of course, is problematic, and it's destructive, it's manipulative, or it's dishonest, and certainly can give science a bad reputation. But that is, though, really different from an alternative way of knowing, for lack of a better term. But that could include traditional ecological knowledge, or different ways in which people can have a relationship with the world or the universe around them. And if you're not purporting to be science, then that way of knowing is not a threat to science. So I think that is something to be understood by scientists, because sometimes I think we can feel threatened or challenged by ways of knowing that we shouldn't feel threatened or challenged by. So the strength of science can also be its weakness, I think. There is this linear, very logical atomization of information, and that can like excavate this very clean and standardized data. But when we think about how messy and convoluted the universe is, I mean, I as someone who has somewhat of an ecology background, I think about this a lot. Expectations for cleanliness sometimes are unreasonable, and in fact, sometimes even limit our ability to truly access a full understanding of something. So I think it's important for scientists to just be realistic about what we can learn from these very precise ways of investigations. So in science, we have these dominant cultural lenses, and we are in pursuit of objectivity, but truly objectivity is a very elusive concept, because we are human beings creating, generating these ideas and trying to investigate them. So we're not capable of operating fully in a vacuum. So there's a quote from Tiakasin Ghost Horse, who is a member of the Lakota Nation, and also a professor at Yale, the School of Divinity and Ecology and Forestry. So I'll read this. The rational mind is the human living within the hierarchy of a box that seeks to capture, through its own narcissistic addiction to the anthropocentrism of a society or a people who hold themselves up as somehow more grandiose than others, in that box of conscience. It deadens the intuitive or non-dogmatic life. This is where the separation begins, with a concept and a word that does not exist within many intuitive languages, such as Lakota, and the word is domination. So basically, by invoking rationality over intuition to defend a viewpoint, a person makes the assertion that what is intuitive and often feminized is neither legitimate nor understandable even, and therefore is not welcome in certain cultural spaces such as scientific institutions. And it's kind of written out of the conversation. So there's this disregard for this other way of knowing, and that disregard can it's sort of the pathway towards domination, which is what Ghost Horse is arguing. And there's this dualistic way of thinking throughout our culture, between life and non-life, male and female, and other categories and this permeates into particularly how we regard human and non-human, and how the limits we then assign to those categories. So again, kind of using mycology as this case study to investigate these ideas, I think that mycology really does sort of inherently, both as a field and a discipline, but also in the fungal biology itself, it really challenges a lot of paradigms and deconstructs a lot of norms in biology. Mycology can sort of disrupt our binary conception of plants versus animals, two-sex mating systems, discrete organismal structure, and often we use these sort of non-normative or multimodal methods for knowledge acquisition. So I'll talk more about all those things in a minute. So again, you guys know this because you're all mycologists, but mycelium is this web-like network of fungal cells that extends apically through substrate and performs sex, seeks nutrients, and builds multi-species and multi-kingdom symbioses. So in this work, we are sort of channeling mycelium, and we're in an attempt to remediate our relationship with fungi and with all organisms, and also they're using that as a conduit to access queerness, and sort of attempting to collapse this emotional space between human and non-human, and myceliated, I guess you could say. So in order to do this, we wanted to explore the dogma of institutional science, which I differentiate from science itself. Science as an institution, you could say capital S science, is a cultural body with power and money, but also lowercase science is the method, which is different. It's you could say it's objective. So we're trying to essentially, I guess, use queer theory as a framework to understand mycology and sort of help scientists access a more ethical, more grounded way of conducting their work. And I do want to explain a little bit more about what queer means, but particularly there's a generational difference. So I want to clarify this. So the crux of our argument is that mycology is a queer science by virtue of its methodology and the qualities and characteristics of fungi. So taking a quick look at the term queer, historically the word queer was used to pejoratively or negatively describe non-heteronormative behaviors. And now people use it to self-identify and describe their existence outside of heteronormativity. In the United States, the word was reclaimed and gained a lot of popular traction during the 1980s AIDS political activism in the 80s and 90s. And it was sort of used to unify subgroups that were not quite captured by the terms gay and lesbian. And it sort of suggests this coalition of people bound together in their non-heteronormativity. And it kind of helped create a sense of greater belonging within the community. And people can identify as queer to describe homosexuality, gender nonconformity, transgender identity, but in general, queer is this sort of fluid concept that invokes both a spirit of community, but also a very strong history of defiance. And therefore, queer theory explores the constructed dichotomy of normative versus deviant, specifically around sexuality, but also systems and frameworks that interact with sexuality. So like basically other human cultural markers such as race, nationality, and other identities. And this field grew from feminist and gay and lesbian studies, which focus on challenging like the essential qualities, quote unquote, of women and femininity, as well as the normativity of heterosexuality, and all those things that become sort of posited as the unspoken and unnamed standard. So it's a challenge to all of those things. So we are trying to sort of explore this relationship between mycology and queerness by defining queer as non-heteronormative identities and expressions, and basically identities, bodies, and behaviors that are pushed to the margins of Western hegemonic life. So again, a little bit more like background. Alternative ways of knowing and knowledge acquisition have been sort of historically delegitimized and erased throughout history. So what gets taken for granted as being truth of scientific endeavors is not always like inherently so. So we know that throughout Western Europe, women had historically been keepers of ecological knowledge, but their voices were excluded from formal participation in science. It wasn't until like 100 years ago or less that women were allowed to be members of the Linnaean Society, which is one of the, a very prominent kind of society based in Europe that is kind of was for a long time like the gatekeeper of what was considered science or not. And then the Royal Society also, I think, didn't allow women until the 1940s. And often the knowledge that they did have was kind of dismissed as folk tales or witchcraft, or old wives' tales, which is a phrase I really don't like. And it was meant to indicate that their knowledge was like irrational and sometimes even unnatural or evil, and had no basis really, and certainly no place in the institutions. And further, there was this idea that women were sort of close to nature, which was not seen as a compliment, right? It was like men were sort of logical and rational, and women were more like the non-human realm because they didn't possess those same capacities that supposedly definitively separated humans from non-human. So the culture there has been disproportionately shaped by a small subset of people. And we argue that that's really limiting to discovery and dangerous for not just the safety and well-being of humans, but also non-human life. And then also religious ideology and discourse influenced understandings of animacy, what does it mean to be non-human, and the relationships among living and non-living things. And that sort of binary distinction actually is not common and is not universal in all cultures or languages to even distinguish specifically between living and non-living. Amongst biblical scholars, it was believed that the word dominion some scholars say that it may have been a mistranslation, and the original text probably used a word more analogous to stewardship. And this translation, it's believed that many Christians then felt empowered to dominate and exploit the earth, and there was this drive for being able to the word made flesh, right? What we can have dominion over, and what can we access, and what are we entitled to sort of use as we see fit, regardless of the consequences. So there's this remarkable ability for fungi to also subvert human domination and defy our expectations. And this has bound fungi culturally to other sort of supernatural forces that were often feared in that predominant culture. So like witches and devils and the demonically possessed. And, this is something that still comes up today. So maybe as mycologists, you may have already have some experience thinking about this, but Linnaeus really did a really big disservice to fungi, and he actually used a lot of phrases like lower plants for one, which is not that's a teleological term, and it suggests that there's some trajectory to evolution, and fungi are really low on that trajectory, and to what is to be optimal, what is an optimal form of life, and also, he referred to them at times as rustici pauperimi, which means the poorest peasants of the vegetation, and which is sort of a very, I mean, it just, there's a lot there. He's regarding, trying to associate class with being a poorly evolved organism and being really disgusted with them. So it's actually widely believed that Linnaeus's treatment of fungi was a disservice to them and actually pushed back the, properly understanding them for a long time. So, Linnaeus's work was sort of organized around this pursuit of an inherent quality that differentiated rather than bound organisms together. It's also widely known that Linnaeus harbored very hierarchical thinking around humans and human race as well. So these things are these frameworks are ones that, as taxonomists, we seek to dismantle. And I'm a taxonomist, and I use taxonomy as a critical tool for, classifying species. And I actually do think that in general, taxonomy can be very undervalued, but that's a topic for another time. But also using taxonomy as a tool to create species limits is also somewhat of a subjective pursuit. So the ways in which we group organisms in and of itself carries with it does depend on the sort of objective of the investigator. And as you probably are familiar, there are numerous different species concepts: phylogenetics, biological, even morphological species concepts. And all of these things sort of shift, and it's actually really challenging to define a species limit, particularly across all of life. So that's, again, that's kind of more of a talk for another time, but yeah. So actually, I think I'm going to skip this. Yeah. So Anna Singh is an anthropologist, and she wrote a few very interesting works that I cited heavily in this paper. They're about basically one was called Mushrooms at the End of the World, which is a ethnographic that looks at Matsutake, and then also Mushrooms as Companion Species, which was an essay about human interactions with fungi. And in that essay, she explores the relationship between the emergence of intensive agriculture as the standard of modernity and progress, and this sort of the way in which this sort of solidified fungi as the enemy to those ideas of modernity and progress. So the emergence of vast fields of grain offered fungal plant parasites a field day and a reputation as the enemy of civilization and then later progress. So it's kind of striking, because when agriculture disrupts and strips bare natural ecologies, particularly through monocultures, those plants are increasingly vulnerable to pests and pathogens, and some of those are fungal. So this notion of progress implies this very particular idea, right? We have a fairly capitalistic endeavor in which we are prioritizing a particular type of productivity and growth and improvement, and this is sort of riddled with a lot of queerphobic discourse, because it suggests that there's progress is hindered through a lack of this heterosexual procreation. So I guess I will go back to this previous slide, sorry, but oops, yeah. This kind of does tie into this concept that we coined called agro-heterosexuality, which is the idea that basically the spread of large-scale agriculture also interacted with both science and Christianity, with scientific discoveries enabling new and often ecologically harmful manipulations of crops, and with Christian domestic and marital structure organized in connection with agriculture. And that's where we kind of arrived at this term agroheterosexuality. So it's this idea that Christian thinkers compared human sexual actions to planting a field, and only those activities that sort of like corresponded with seeding or procreation were accepted as natural, and the activities that were impeding or ignoring reproduction were sort of seen as forbidden or against nature. So also, as cereal and farming under capitalism intensified, like historically throughout Eurasia, families were expected to give a portion of their yields to the elite. So mushrooms grew wild on these untended margins of farms and then were incorporated into people's diets sort of under the table. And this provided a form of nourishment outside of the reach of the state. So this is something that Anna Singh explores in that essay. And she has this quote, so biological and social diversity huddle defensively in neglected margins. Most everywhere, a negative correlation exists between diversity and the intensity of capital investment and state control. So she also even refers to mushrooms and mushroom forests or forests in which they're abundant as these sort of sites for indeterminate encounters where there's no prescribed measure of sort of this particular notion of productivity or success, sort of the anti-plantation. And it's through the interplay of these factors, this dominant heteronormative structure and capitalist drive, that the disdain for fungus sort of crystallizes. That is her assertion. So she calls the way in which people would mushroom hunt on the edges of their farms as mushroom hunting on the seams of empire, which I think is pretty nice. So you can say we can say that mycology is queer insofar it is marginal, subordinate, contested, and ridiculed. Fungi, but also I think more importantly, mycology is queer insofar as it is disruptive, collective, transformative, and revolutionary. Fungi are queer at the organismal level. They are non-binary. They are neither plants nor animals, but possess a mixture of qualities that are common to both. And this really does upend a prevailing binary, of course, as scientists, or mycologists, we are aware of that, but culturally it is challenging to that, like the average person's understanding of these things. And it's actually, as you probably know, it's really rare for a fungus to actually only have two biological sexes. And the famous Schizophilum commune, or the split gill, has as many as 23,000 mating types. When two compatible fungi meet, their mycelia may fuse and then enter and become basically one body, sexually recombine, and then remain somatically as one as they sort of continue to live and grow and explore in their environment. And then we have the phylum Glomeromycota, which currently is only known to be asexual, the entire phylum. We have the Labolbiniales, which were my study group, which have both distinct bodies for male and female reproductive structures, or those structures may be found in one body, and sometimes so monoecious and dioecious, and sometimes monoecious and dioecious co-occur on the same insect. Mycology has queer investigators. So of respondents to the Mycological Society of America's 2018 survey, 12% of mycologists respondents identified as LGBTQ, which is 3 to 4 times the national reported average. And one will quickly notice, I'm not sure if everyone here has been to an MSA conference, but I was struck initially by sort of the both the rigor of the science, but the simultaneous informality of the event. I remember one of my friends was wearing like tie-dye spandex, and you see a lot of tattoos, and it just kind of has this comforting casual air of like an odd family reunion. Mycology also is queer methodologically. So we use sensing, intuition, experience, storytelling. And a lot of mycological experts do operate outside of institutional affiliations. It's not uncommon to know a mycologist who is very well respected, but actually didn't receive any or much formal training. And I would say that for many mycologists, our relationship with fungi sort of stir very powerful emotions, and we identify with them on a fairly deep level. Um, so, due to the marginalization of fungi, whatever poisonous and degenerative qualities exist amongst a small subset of them, they become mapped onto the character of fungi as a whole. And this is indicative of like sort of the devaluation, which you can't say for plants, for example, even though of course we know that there exist many plants that are very toxic or dangerous to touch. We can't even, there's only that one fungus in Japan that we know of that is actually dangerous to touch, but you can put most mushrooms even in your mouth and spit them out and you would be fine. But that's completely not true for plants, but yet we allow them to possess like a broader, basically their entire realm, their whole spectrum of life is we kind of give them the space for, which is not said for fungi. I mean, I'm sure many of you have also experienced this, but I can't even tell you the number of times that telling someone I'm a mycologist evokes this weird reaction. Often it's like people laugh, just like straight up laugh about it, or like they'll say, make some sort of joke with, they're trying. I don't want to be like mean, but then I've had people even be like I had this one woman just like purse her lips at me when I told her I was a mycologist. She was just like, and who knows what was going on in her head, but it was just it's just a very odd reaction because people don't know what to think, or they just think of like psychedelics, which I'm not saying is there's anything wrong with that, but then, or they think of like, I don't know, that they're just gross and weird. So, there's not this, they're just not given space to be these complex ecological beings in people's imagination. So this is sort of the crux, right? Where organisms and bodies that are difficult to neatly categorize create insecurity and a lack of control within the viewer, who then responds with fear, revulsion, and hatred. And we see this again across many aspects of our society. So what becomes difficult to discern and then therefore like feel like you have control over, through systems of oppression and dogmatic scientific understandings, can become threats to institutions, right? So sort of this is the application of the queer and feminist lens, which, to understand mycophobia and the parallels between mycology and queerness, and mycophobia and queerphobia. So as with queer people, fungi are believed to be deviations of organisms that fit into that, deviations from organisms that fit into these neat boxes, and reproduce and relate to one another in very predictable, orderly, measurable, and quantifiable ways. So yeah, I mean, in this example, this was, I think, something I noticed really early on. And in fact, in applying to grad school way back now, it feels so long ago. But I remember struggling to find a mycology program because I kept seeing forest pathology, and I'm like, I don't I'm not trying to research forest pathology. I want to research mycology. And I didn't quite understand that mycology was like enveloped under forest pathology. It actually didn't make sense to me. So I would see that a department didn't list a mycology program, and I didn't know that if I had to look for forest or plant pathology, and then I would find the mycology, which is interesting because, this is setting the stage for how you're approaching the organism of your study. You're approaching it through this lens of pathology. And of course, we know that there are many fungi that are pathogens. I do study now rust fungi, which are agricultural pathogens. And even the fungi that I studied, the Lobolbiniales, are parasites on insects. Well, the term parasite is debatable, to be honest. That's another whole talk. But in any case, they're sort of I do study pathogenic fungi, but that's just where the funding was, which is another thing. But the idea that you're approaching fungi as something to be fought or controlled or eliminated, as opposed to the entire breadth of their capacity and their roles and functions in ecosystems. So you're sort of setting the stage of how you're going to interact with these organisms, and sort of stating pretty clearly what the perspective that you hold for them and what that is. So to this day, I think if an institution has a mycology dedicated lab at all, and few do, it's probably going to be in this sub-department or department. So as Tanya mentioned, I did my PhD at ESF, which has a really long and wonderful tradition of mycological research, but it is in the department of, the sub-department is plant pathology and mycology. So, it's still, even at a school that has like 100 years of mycological research, it's still sort of first plant pathology or forest pathology, sorry. What is my degree in? Okay. So I am going to skip this because I know we're getting a little short on time. So let me just scoot through. I do want to mention this one thinker, Donna Haraway. We cite her a lot in this paper, and she was an influential thinker is an influential thinker in anthropology. And she talks a lot about species kinship, particularly, multi-species kinships. And she has this quote that I like: "I'm not a post-humanist. I am who I become with companion species, who and which make a mess out of categories in the making of kin and kind. Queer messmates in mortal play indeed." So she, and a lot of her work offers these interventions into this binaristic discourse that alienates us humans from the natural world. She coined the term nature cultures, which is like basically the idea that when you invoke the word nature, there is a cultural context. And we often think of culture as being existing apart from nature, and she sort of seeks to dissolve that idea, and argues that that is an illusion, and that there is no such that's an artificial divide. So companion species, or are organisms who have these communal and bodily existences that are interdependent, and we should recognize ourselves, all organisms, as being like fundamentally and inextricably interdependent. Yes. So again, I'm going to sort of scoot through a little bit. I would love to talk more about a lot of these things, but I don't want to put you to sleep. I do want to also mention Robin Kimmerer, who was very inspirational in the kind of formation of this work. She was also on my committee. She is an Indigenous woman professor at ESF. She's a member of the Potawatomi Nation. And she talks about, she writes a lot about traditional ecological knowledge. She's a botanist as well. So she talks about how there is a tension at times between traditional ecological knowledge and institutional science, but that tension does not really need to exist. They can actually really complement one another. So she writes a lot about how her life as both a trained scientist and an Indigenous person. So she presents this word papawi, which means the force which causes mushrooms to push up from the earth overnight. And she, as a biologist, she also writes, this is a quote, but it's not up. As a biologist, I was stunned that such a word existed. In all its technical vocabulary, Western science has no such term, no words to hold this mystery. You think that biologists of all people would have had the words for life, but in scientific language, our terminology is used to define the boundaries of knowing, and what lies beyond our grasp remains unnamed. So she's reflecting on, Western scientific discourse and the need to mark bounds of existing knowledge. And she explains that this term is sort of it speaks to an awareness that maybe this understanding of animacy beyond the Western scientific reach. And it's not that it's permanently beyond our reach, but it just is right now. But yet people for millennia have been operating with the knowledge of this force and this sort of the energy that animates the life around us. And we're starting to engage with that a little bit more as scientists. We're starting to attach quantitative data to notions that have been held by others, people by millennia, for millennia. But we're still sort of, I think, in some cases, not asking the right questions. So I do, along that line, I have an analogy that I find to be useful. So discourse, this is actually presented by a writer named Ricky Ann Wilchins. And if you're interested in the references for this, I can send that. It's also in the paper, which is open access. So discourse is a cookie cutter and gender is the dough. And the shape made by the cutter tells us more about the cutter than the dough. And then I extend this to science and science and methodology. So science and methodology is the cutter, the dough is all that can be learned, and the cutter is shaped to accommodate the biological and methodological realities of, in this case, non-fungal organisms. So we might, ask questions or expect results to fulfill certain shapes, even if those shapes actually aren't really the ones that are reflected around us. So we do that a lot in science. And we know that objectivity is actually fairly meaningless when it comes to gender and queerness, because the very notion of queerness, the production of some genders as queer and the search for their origin and meaning, those are exertions of power. And fungi are similarly defiant of objectivity and standardization. So when we, for example, when we talk about, when we conduct surveys, if you're trying to survey a plot of forest and quantify the fungi in that area, you come across a flush of, let's say, armillaria, and you see all those armillaria growing. Maybe there's 130 of them in mushrooms, and there's actually not a universally applied answer to how you approach that, right? Do you count them as one mushroom because there may be one genetic individual? Do you count them as 30 individual fruiting body, 130 individual fruiting bodies? You'd have to maybe sequence all of them to know for sure if they were one. So actually different scientists in different spaces will take different approaches to that. We actually haven't even quantified or standardized exactly how we do some of the most basic things in mycology, because it doesn't quite, it doesn't quite work. So even, we don't, if a mycelium is present in a space, but it's not fruiting, do we count that as being present? Because, yes, it's in the soil, but maybe the conditions aren't right for it to fruit. And those conditions might not be right due to climatic forces, like, drought or something that we care a lot about. So how do we, all of these things are actually really challenging for us. And it's because that fungi are not as discrete of organisms as, say, birds or even trees. And again, not that all organisms exist in community with others, but fungi in particular are very much embedded in a series, a multitude of organisms, and very tightly tied to abiotic factors as well. So throughout mycology, we run into problems like this. And I think, let me see, I think I'm going to skip. I think I probably should just stop there because there's a lot. Well, okay, no, sorry. I do want to talk about the material impacts of this, everything that I've been saying. So we have this, conservation of fungi is far behind the conservation of a lot of other organisms. So we know that there have been tens of thousands of animals and plants that have been assessed and by the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, whereas there's only 56 species of fungi that have been evaluated and placed on that list, and then of those 43 have ended up on that list. So there is not some magical ability for fungi to skirt through the mass extinction event, the Anthropocene, that's unfolding around us, but we just actually don't have the data to advocate for their protection. And that is a combination of, that is in the material result of everything that I was just describing. So we have, we're far behind, and it's both that fungi are difficult to quantify, where it's difficult to conduct this conservation work, but also we have very few mycologists relatively to botanists or zoologists. So we don't have, we both, like, the data is challenging, but we could probably work through that if we just had the resources that other groups have. So there is a very material outcome to conservation, and I don't think this is just purely this academic exercise, although it is a fun one. Also, this idea of, like, what is the relevance of an isolated human genome? I think, you know, we think a lot about, or I think a lot about the importance of understanding that bodies are in fact communities, and, you know, even our human body has more fungal and bacterial cells in the human body than there are human cells. And again, this is an idea, like the idea, the ways in which we're deeply embedded is one that is recognized and has been held by cultures around the world, but has been sort of dismissed by Western culture, which sort of seeks to elevate the individual, right? We have this idea that an individual can be great and can, you know, be responsible for their success. And while obviously personal individualistic traits can serve you well in particular situations, rarely is it true, is one's, you know, vitality and success and whatnot actually really due to their individual capacity. And it has more to do with the circumstances, the community in which they are raised, and the way the access is, you know, access to resources that they have been provided through communal effort. So I do think that that individualized notion also is, again, results in a very material consequence, which is that we've positioned humans as being superior to the natural world, and that's how we've arrived in this climate crisis. So I think it's really important to, you know, to recognize this. I think this Donna Haraway quote puts it really nicely, like, to be one is always to become with many. And I think we as scientists would do well to reflect on the ways in which we you know, are sort of in denial of that. And I think our climate and environmental advocacy should certainly be rooted in an intersectional awareness of all the forces, the environmental forces, but also the social forces that have led us to this particular time in this, like, particular climate precipice. So yeah, I think in general, oops, let me go back. Fungi are sort of these excellent teachers. They can, just like they have remediated our soils and can remediate our bodies and provide us with an environment, we too, I think reciprocally, as their kin, can remediate their soils and remediate their waters and kind of undo the greed and the capitalistic drive that has set the earth in this space. And I think we can turn to them as for a sense of inspiration and reclamation of our shared world. So I think I'll stop there. So thank you so much. And this is my email and Hosmic, my co-author's email, and my Twitter handle if you want to follow me or talk to me more about this. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome, amazing. Did we have any questions for Patty? I don't see any in the chat. It's primarily been me putting stuff down in the chat.
Hello, I have a question if I can ask it aloud.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. This talk was so awesome. And I feel like you said everything that I've been thinking in my mind, and to hear it in words was super cool.
Oh, cool.
So I have two questions. So my first question is, when you were talking about agriculture and how that kind of almost further led to marginalization of mycology, I wonder if you kind of see a shift in that now, almost similar to how now in some ways queerness is becoming, like, certain aspects of queerness is becoming more accepted by the mainstream and almost like appropriated. Now we have like agriculture looking how to harness like the powers of symbiotic fungi for like better agriculture production. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that at all. And my other question was how, as someone, you know, who's doing both this more philosophical work as well as science, like how do you balance those two disciplines and like stay rooted in both of them throughout your work? So
thank you
those are my
so
questions.
Thank you so much for those questions. Those are really thoughtful. Yeah, so I do think that mycology, there has been certainly a perceptible like boom in like interest, and I think that, you know, I do talk about this a little bit more in the paper, but there have been other times in history where, you know, there are trends in what is accepted in science that kind of follow trends in the zeitgeist, or like kind of wherever we are as a culture. So even the concepts of mutualism and like lichen symbiosis, those were really fiercely debated when they were first proposed. But then there were different times in throughout history where they became a little bit more popular. And in the 60s and 70s in particular, that was one time period in which those ideas became more popular. And, you know, and during that time, you know, we were having the psychedelic revolution, civil rights movement, and ecology as a discipline was also gaining traction generally. And ecology is so deeply rooted in sort of a recognition of mutualism, or at least symbiosis. So I do see that, you know, I don't think it's totally a coincidence, although this is speculative and qualitative, I suppose, but, you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that the greater interest in mycology is in sort of tandem with a greater respect for queer identity. You know, I think it's not, you know, these things do, like, you know, as I was saying, they don't exist. Neither of them exist totally apart from one another. So I also do explore more in detail, like the commodification of nature in the written work, where I talk about like which fungi become acceptable to society. And usually they can either be eaten, or they're medicinal, or they have some direct impact on human life. And all the others, you know, are not. So you eat on an individual basis, people become comfortable with fungi culturally, so like penicillin or morels or something like that. But then when it's neither delicious or particularly useful, then it still kind of remains in this category of you know, unknown and unwanted. And you see the sort of commodification of marginalized identities is sort of similar, right? This happens certainly to queer culture, but I think it happens the most to Black American or Africans and Black people, whether they live in the United States or not. And whereas like certain aspects of their culture are sort of taken when they are fitting to a particular, you know, to the white gaze, and the rest, you know, is not accepted. So I do think that idea of like, you know, what can you consume and what can you possess is something deeply rooted in capitalism, right? And I think it's something, I think all of these things, now I'm not trying to always say that these things are always the same in material, but the logic is the same, right? So I'm not trying to say that, you know, to be a mycologist is the same as having a certain identity. I wouldn't, but the logics between like, what are you entitled towards, what can you consume, and how can you, but yet how do you at the same time create distance while consuming the product of someone else, is something that I think everyone needs to be reflect on and reject. So I think that I've also seen a sort of worrying trend in the rise of very extractive foraging, and you know, like people doing it for like sort of social media, right? But not necessarily then participating in more land stewardship, which does concern me. Yeah, so I think I got your questions. right? Was there anything else to that?
Yeah, thank you so much. I was also curious about how you, as like a scholar, work with both mycology and philosophy.
Oh yeah, thank you. Okay, so I mean, so this ended up being a chapter in my thesis, sort of, and that actually I was really directly encouraged by Dr. Kimmerer to put it in my thesis, which was really helpful to me because I was nervous about it because, you know, I am trained as a scientist, and my committee before I added Dr. Kimmerer was all, you know, pure science. So I was not sure how that would go over. And then I was also a little afraid that things could be misconstrued, or, you know, some of the issues that I'm talking about could be taken out of context and, you know, kind of referred to as like anti-science or something like that. So, I mean, I still sort of carry a little bit of apprehension around talking about this to scientists because I want to be understood, right? And I don't want to. But I think in general, actually, the feedback has been very positive, and people, I think it's tapped into. I think there are a lot more of us thinking about these things than I had realized, and I'm really great. I've heard a lot of people tell me like that they are glad to have encountered this work because it makes them, as a scientist, feel more kind of rooted in this feeling that they are political. You know, like science is not apolitical, right? And even though, again, we strive towards objectivity, but it's an elusive pursuit. So we need to then know what to do with that once we can't quite reach it. So, and particularly, I think science can be used at the service of really liberatory concepts, but it has also historically been used for really destructive ones, like eugenics is like a very good example. So I think scientists need to be able to talk about that history and if you never reflect on the ways in which it's been used for evil or for harm, then you are at risk of repeating that, even if you don't study like race science, but you know, as scientists, you know, if you work for an institution, that institution has a legacy and has weight, and I think it's important for you to understand how that has been utilized and wielded in the past. Thanks for your questions.
Awesome. Well, do we have any other questions?
Well, yeah, feel free to reach out to me over email or social media. I'd be very happy to talk more to anyone privately. I'm really grateful for everyone here taking the time to listen. Thank you.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. This will be the end of the presentation today. Join us next time. Next month, we'll have our next two speakers. But until then, have a good day. I'll see you all later.
Bye. Thanks for hosting, Tanya.
Of course. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Hi.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Hi, Pat. Oh, she's gone already.
Oh, she's gone. That was really interesting.